Welcome back to Chess Dog. I'm John, and today we have a game between Magnus Carlsen and Alexander Naumann. Not Niemann, Naumann. This was played at the European Club Cup. This is played at a classical time control. At the time of the game, Magnus has a rating of 2856, and Alexander Naumann has a rating of 2513. And in this game, Magnus sacrifices 3 pawns for an attack. This is really a fantastic game. Let's jump right in. Magnus has white. Naumann has black. Magnus begins with e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, and d4. Magnus plays the Scotch game, avoiding the more commonly played lines of the Italian or Spanish. Pawn takes, knight takes d4, and knight to f6. This is a very common defense. And in this line, black usually gets active pieces, but white gets a bit better pawn structure. That's normally how this goes. We'll see how it happens here. Knight takes knight, pawn takes, e5, and queen to e7. He doesn't want to have to move the knight just yet. He plays queen to e7, and then white puts his queen on e2, blocking his own bishop. Now the knight goes to d5. And the most commonly played move here is c4, immediately kicking that well-centralized knight out of the way. But Magnus plays the move knight to d2. And the idea is he might come to knight f3 to overprotect the e5 pawn. But it does give this knight on d5 quite a bit of flexibility. And Naumann plays knight to f4. The main line here is g6, immediately going after this e5 pawn. But knight to f4, obviously hitting the queen. Magnus plays queen to e3, hitting the knight. And when the knight goes back to d5, then he goes queen to e4. Why not queen to e4 immediately? Well, there's nothing wrong with that. But usually in this case, black will play knight to g6 and have a little bit better position, actually. So queen to e3 is sort of tempting black to play the knight to d5, which he does. Queen to e4. Now f6, a common idea to try to liquidate this e5 pawn, which can become a real problem suffocating black's activity. So he wants to attack that e5 point. Magnus plays c4. If he takes the pawn, then after knight takes and the exchange of queens, you just have a dead equal position here, basically. So Magnus, to keep the complications going, plays the move c4, and now the knight goes to b4. And this knight is quite dangerous. It's aiming at this c2 square, which would fork the king and the rook. And at the moment, the only piece defending it is the queen on e4, so if black can kick that queen away, he'd be in really good shape, which is why the most natural move here is a blunder, the most natural move being a3. Kick that knight out as quickly as possible. But what black would do in that case is not move the knight, but play d5, hitting the queen. After pawn takes, if white takes the knight with the queen, then queen takes e5 check, revealing the attack of the bishop on the queen, so he can't do that. If instead he plays the queen to b1 to try to keep control over this c2 square, then queen takes e5 check, bishop e2, and bishop to f5. And this queen is not very happy about her situation. It really has nowhere to go at all, and white would just be lost. So what Magnus does is he plays the king to d1, keeps that king in the center of the board. And he can't castle after this, so it's very committal, but this does keep the knight out of the c2 square. Queen takes e5. He could play d5, but after pawn takes, you still get a fairly even endgame either way. Queen takes e5, a3 to kick the knight. Now, queen takes e4, knight e4, and now the knight can only go to a6, and now b4. And this knight is not very happy. The knight at a6 does not have a very bright future right now. I mean, where can it go? Like, it has to go back to its home square to have any chance of activity. So that's a feather in Magnus's cap. Magnus has a great position with only one problem. He's sacrificed a pawn, so he's down a pawn. That's the only problem with his position. c5 to try to gain some space on the queen side. b5, hitting that knight. Instead of moving the knight, Naumann plays bishop to b7, counterattacking the knight in the middle of the board. Bishop to d3 to defend that knight, and now the knight has to move. The knight goes to b8. Still not very well placed. Rook to e1. Places his rook opposite the king, and we talked about how white's king, was stuck in the middle of the board, but now black's king is under quite a bit of pressure also, and Naumann plays the king to f7. The knight goes back to c3, and here it looks like black can just take Magnus's pawn on g2, grabbing a second pawn. But if he does, he's losing a lot of tempo And Magnus gets a huge attack after bishop to f4, d6, bishop to f5. The bishop's coming in with check, and black would be in a very, very bad shape in that position. So instead, Naumann, who was a strong player, I mean, over 2,500, knowing that, plays the bishop to d6, developing the pieces. Now f4, controlling the key squares, key square e5, and now bishop takes g2. And now Magnus is down 2 pawns, but he doesn't have that maneuver from the previous variation. He doesn't have access to the f4 square. So Naumann says, okay, now I'll take the extra material. Magnus plays king to c2. By the way, if you're getting value from this video, be sure to click the subscribe button and the bell notification button for future videos. And the like button too while you're at it. So here, Naumann plays g6. Wants to control this f5 square, limit the mobility of this bishop. Computers say that a6, trying to escape on the queen side, is better, but after a4, it looks to me like black is still bottled up over there on that side of the board. So he plays g6, bishop to b7. Now that after g6, this f6 square and this dark square diagonal have been softened up. So he places the bishop at b2 to take advantage of that. And now, the best move for black would be f5. And after something like, say, knight d5, rook to e8, computers say this is still an equal position. Black has a couple of pawns, white has some activity. It breaks even. But instead, Alexander Naumann gets a little greedy and takes a third pawn, thinking he can hold on tightly and survive the onslaught. Well, we'll see about that. Magnus plays rook to e2, gaining a tempo against the bishop. There are a lot of lines opening up at this king. The bishop retreats, and now rook to f1. And after sacrificing 3 pawns, all of Magnus's pieces are ready to attack. And that king is sort of all by himself there on f7. Poor guy. You almost feel bad for him, don't you? g5, trying to clog things up by defending the bishop. h4. Alexander Naumann plays d6. h6 might have been better, but after knight to e4, he's crashing in on f6, and it's still very, very strong for white. So he plays d6. What he's trying to do is trying to retreat the bishop to e5 and create a sort of a strong point here to try to block all of white's activity. Pawn takes, and now he moves the bishop to e5. If he takes with the pawn, then just bishop to c1, and Magnus crashes through on the f-file with the pinned bishop. And if the bishop takes, then just rook f to e1, threatening the check, picking up the c7 pawn. You defend, then boom, and you pick up the other pawn instead, and this is just totally lost for black. So instead, Alexander Naumann plays bishop to e5, trying to keep things as clogged as possible. Knight to e4, putting pressure on this f6 pawn along with this rook and g5 pawn. Knight to d7, trying to defend it as much as possible. Knight takes pawn, knight takes knight, bishop takes e5, d-e5, and black's position is pretty much completely collapsed. Now, there is a mistake Magnus could have made here. It's not a mistake he would ever make, given his level of endgame ability. But if he actually takes the knight with the pawn, then after, say, rook a to e8, bishop f5, rook h g8, this is actually an equal endgame. Black would have fought through all of the pressure. But Magnus, of course, plays the best move, and pretty obvious for a player of his level. Rook takes e5, and he's threatening to grab on c5. He's threatening to take the knight. Black's king is completely bare, and in this position, Alexander Naumann resigned, being completely lost. Computers give something like +8 for white. Now, even after this great game from Magnus Carlsen, there's still some great chess you're missing out on. To fix that problem, I believe the video you're going to want to watch is this great game from Magnus. I'm confident you'll enjoy it.